On November 14, 1998, 7 soldiers gathered near the eastern gate for a routine perimeter patrol. Sergeant Michael Reeves, the leader, 32 years old with a quiet authority that made younger soldiers stand a little straighter. His best friend in the unit, Corporal Danny Hutchins, older by a year and always the loudest voice in the room, ribbed him about driving too slow. Private First Class Andre Williams, the quiet one who never missed Sunday chapel, checked his gear one last time. Private Marcus Cole, just 19 and fresh out of basic training, tried to hide how nervous he was on his first real assignment. Specialist Ryan Schaefer, the mechanic who could fix anything with enough time and duct tape, climbed into the back of the transport truck. Private Terrence Jackson, TJ to everyone who knew him, former college linebacker with a knee that ended his football dreams, helped Private First Class Elena Vance load the last of the equipment. Elena was one of the few women in the unit, disciplined and capable, with a younger sister back in Lexington who thought she was invincible. 7 soldiers. 7 lives intersecting on an ordinary night that would become anything but. Every case you hear on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of research, cross-checking facts, verifying records, and piecing together fragments of real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, then please take a second to subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments what part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support isn't just a number, it's the reason we keep going. Now, let's get back to the case. They left the base at 19:30 hours, the transport truck rumbling along the access road toward Blackwood Ridge. The route was familiar. Check the perimeter along the eastern boundary, sweep the old mining roads, log any irregularities, and return before midnight. They'd done it dozens of times. The road wound through farmland first, then dense forest, then into the shadows of abandoned coal country where the ground was riddled with old shafts and sinkholes. Locals avoided that stretch after dark. They said the fog played tricks on your eyes out there, that the woods felt different, heavier, like they were holding on to something they didn't want to give back. But soldiers don't put much stock in superstition. They follow orders. And that night, the orders were simple. At 21:12, dispatch received a radio call. Sergeant Reeves reported they'd picked up a secondary alert about suspicious activity near an abandoned mining facility 2 miles off their standard route. He requested permission to investigate. Command approved, told him to check it out and report back within the hour. At 21:47, Reeves radioed again. His voice was calm, professional. He said they were approaching the site, visibility was low, and they'd update in 15 minutes. That was the last transmission anyone ever received from them. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. Dispatch tried to raise them on every frequency. Nothing but static. By midnight, the base had gone to full alert. By dawn, search teams were assembled, helicopters were in the air, and the largest military search operation in the county's history was underway. They found the truck first. It was parked near a tree line about a quarter mile from the mining facility. Engine cold, doors hanging open, headlights off. Inside, they found weapons secured in their racks, canteens half full, a deck of cards scattered across the back seat, personal effects untouched, but no soldiers, no blood, no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away. Nothing. 7 people had driven into the fog and vanished. The earth had swallowed every trace of them. The search that followed was relentless. Helicopters swept the ridgelines from first light until darkness forced them down. K-9 units were brought in from 3 counties. Ground teams spread through the forest in organized grids, calling names that echoed off the hills and disappeared into silence. Soldiers walked shoulder to shoulder with deputies and volunteers, checking every ravine, every creek bed, every collapsed mine entrance they could find. They found nothing. Days turned into weeks. The old mining tunnels were cleared and searched. Sinkholes were probed with specialized equipment. Divers checked the deeper sections of Hollow Creek where the current ran cold and fast. Every tip was investigated. Every rumor was chased down. Every supposed sighting evaporated the moment someone looked too closely. A hunter claimed he'd seen figures moving through the trees 2 nights after the disappearance. Deputies followed his directions and found only deer tracks. A truck driver reported picking up a hitchhiker in military fatigues near the state line. turned out to be a teenager in a surplus jacket. A psychic called the sheriff's office, swearing she knew where the bodies were buried. She led them to a construction site 30 miles away that had been paved over months earlier. Nothing fit, nothing made sense, nothing brought those 7 soldiers home. By the end of November, the first vigil formed outside the gates of Fort Brecken. Families huddled together in the cold, candles trembling in their hands, faces illuminated by flickering light and desperate hope. Sergeant Reeves's wife, Sarah, stood at the front clutching a photograph of her husband, refusing to believe he wasn't coming back. Danny Hutchins's fiancée, Becca, waited at the gate every morning, watching for a face she'd never see again. Andre Williams's mother flew in from Louisville and spent her nights in the base chapel, praying until her voice gave out. Marcus Cole's parents wandered the perimeter like ghosts, calling their son's name into the trees. The base had no answers to give them, only silence. By early December, the official search was scaled back. Resources were redirected, personnel were reassigned. The investigation continued on paper, but the momentum was gone. There were no leads, no evidence, no witnesses, just 7 empty bunks and a truck full of questions nobody could answer. The military held a memorial service that winter. 7 empty caskets draped in flags. 7 families handed folded triangles of fabric as a substitute for the people they loved. The chaplain spoke about sacrifice and honor and the mysteries that only God could understand. But there was no understanding this, no sense to be made. Just absence where presence used to be. Just silence where laughter used to echo. Just a wound that refused to heal because no one could explain how it had been made. Every case you hear on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of research, cross-checking military records, interviewing families, and piecing together fragments of real lives that were lost. Each episode takes us nearly 15 to 20 days of work. Long nights, quiet hours, and countless moments spent chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter. Because somewhere out there, someone deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, then please take a second to subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments what part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support isn't just a number, it's the reason we keep going. Now, let's get back to the case. The years that followed were merciless in their silence. The headlines faded. The reporters moved on to fresher tragedies. The rest of the world kept spinning as though 7 lives hadn't been erased from it. But in Millers Creek and Fort Brecken, time moved differently. The wound never closed. It just scabbed over, tender and raw, impossible to forget. Sarah Reeves raised her 2 children alone. She never remarried. She kept Michael's dress uniform pressed and hanging in the closet, his medals displayed on the mantel, his photograph on the nightstand where she could see it first thing every morning and last thing every night. She told the kids stories about their father, his patience, his laugh, the way he made everyone feel safe, but she couldn't tell them where he went. She didn't know. And that not knowing was its own kind of prison. Becca Hutchins waited a full year before she finally accepted that Danny wasn't coming home. She left Millers Creek in the spring of 2000, moved to Cincinnati, started over, eventually got married, had children, built a new life on top of the ruins of the old one. But she kept Danny's engagement ring in a box in her dresser. And every November 14th, she lit a candle and sat alone in the dark, remembering the man who was supposed to be her forever. Andre Williams' mother never stopped believing her son would come home. She went to church every Sunday, kept a candle burning in her window, wrote letters to every government agency that might listen. Most went unanswered. She died in 2015, still waiting for news that never came. Marcus Cole's parents aged 2 decades in the first 12 months. His father stopped going to work. His mother stopped leaving the house. They'd given their only child to the Army, trusted the uniform, believed in the mission. And the Army had given them nothing back but silence and sympathy cards. Elena Vance's younger sister, Maria, enlisted in 2003. She wanted to honor Elena, to carry on what her sister had started. She served 2 tours overseas, earned commendations, became everything Elena always said she could be. But every time she put on that uniform, she thought about her sister. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw Elena's face staring back. Sheriff Raymond Caldwell, the man who'd coordinated the civilian search effort back in 1998, never let go of the case, even after the military declared it unresolved. Even after his own department shelved the file, he kept a copy at home, reviewed it on quiet nights, drove out to Blackwood Ridge every November 14th, walked the tree line, stood in the fog, and whispered apologies to soldiers he couldn't find. He retired in 2005, but retirement didn't bring peace. The case followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. Years became decades. The Blackwood Seven became legend, a cautionary tale told to new recruits, a ghost story whispered around campfires. Some people claimed they saw lights in the forest on foggy nights. Others swore they heard voices on the wind. A few said the whole area was cursed, that anyone who went near it was tempting fate. But most people just stopped talking about it, not because they'd forgotten, because remembering hurt too much. And then, 22 years later, the earth finally gave them back. April 2020. The world was locked down, consumed by a pandemic that had rewritten every rule of daily life. In Millers Creek, the streets were quieter than they'd been in decades. Stores were closed. Churches held services online. People stayed home and waited for the chaos to pass. Harold Messer was a farmer, 63 years old, third generation on the same land his grandfather had worked. His property sat about 4 miles from Blackwood Ridge, bordered by dense woods on one side and a swollen creek on the other. That spring, heavy rains had hammered the region for weeks. The creek jumped its banks, the lower pastures flooded, and when the water finally receded, Harold noticed something strange near the back of his property. A sinkhole, about 15 feet wide, 6 feet deep. The ground had collapsed inward, revealing dark soil and jagged rock beneath. He drove his tractor out to take a look, figuring he'd need to fill it in before one of his cattle stumbled into it. But as he climbed down into the depression, his boot struck something hard, metal, rusted but unmistakable. At first he thought it was old farm equipment, a plow blade, part of an engine. This was coal country. The ground was full of forgotten things. Then he brushed the dirt away and saw it. A belt buckle, military issue, and beneath it, half buried in the clay, the unmistakable outline of human remains. Harold Messer called 911 at 2:47 in the afternoon on April 12, 2020. Within hours, his quiet pasture had become a crime scene. Deputies arrived first, then state police, then military investigators who drove down from Fort Brecken with grim faces and excavation equipment. Yellow tape went up around the sinkhole. Forensic teams in white suits descended into the pit. Floodlights illuminated the dig as the sun set, and the work continued through the night. What they found was worse than anyone had prepared for. 7 sets of skeletal remains, buried in a shallow trench beneath layers of sediment, arranged side by side almost deliberately, as though someone had taken the time to lay them out before covering them with dirt. Dog tags confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts: Reeves, Hutchins, Williams, Cole, Schaefer, Jackson, Vance. The Blackwood Seven had been found, 22 years in the ground, 22 years of silence, 22 years of families wondering, waiting, hoping for answers that never came. And now, at last, the earth had surrendered its secret. The news hit Millers Creek like a shockwave. People who hadn't spoken about the case in years stood frozen in front of their televisions, tears running down their faces. The diner fell silent when the sheriff's press conference aired. Church bells rang for the first time since the memorial service in 1999. Flags at Fort Brecken dropped to half staff. The families were notified before the public announcement. Sarah Reeves collapsed when she heard. For 22 years, she'd told herself that maybe somehow Michael was still alive, lost somewhere, amnesiac, unable to contact her. The confirmation that he was dead killed that fragile hope forever. But it also ended the torture of not knowing. For the first time in 2 decades, she could finally begin to grieve. Sheriff Caldwell, now 74 and living in an assisted care facility, heard about the discovery on the evening news. He demanded to be taken to the site. His caretakers tried to talk him out of it, told him he was too frail, that the terrain was too rough. He didn't listen. He'd made a promise to those families 22 years ago. And even if he was too late to save those soldiers, he wasn't going to miss the chance to say goodbye. He stood at the edge of Harold Messer's pasture as the sun went down, watching the forensic teams work in silence. He didn't speak for a long time, just stood there, hands trembling, tears cutting through the lines on his weathered face. Someone asked him how he felt. He shook his head slowly. "I always knew they were out here somewhere," he said. "I just wish I'd found them sooner. I wish I'd dug deeper. I wish I'd never stopped looking." When the remains were transported to the state crime lab in Frankfurt, investigators expected to find evidence of an accident, a cave-in, a collapse in one of the old mine tunnels. Something that would explain how 7 soldiers could vanish without a trace. What they found instead changed everything. Multiple victims showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. The fracture patterns weren't consistent with a fall or a structural collapse. They were consistent with deliberate strikes, with weapons, with violence. 2 of the soldiers had broken ribs that had occurred around the time of death, defensive injuries, signs of a struggle. And then there was Private Marcus Cole, the youngest of the 7, 19 years old. The rookie who'd been so eager to prove himself. His remains showed something the others didn't, a clean, precise cut through one of the vertebrae in his neck, the kind of wound that could only be made by a blade. Marcus Cole hadn't died in an accident. He'd been executed. The realization sent a shockwave through the investigation. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a massacre. 7 soldiers had been ambushed, overpowered, and murdered. Their bodies had been buried deliberately on land that was never searched in 1998, hidden beneath decades of rain and sediment until a freak sinkhole exposed what someone had worked very hard to erase. The case was reclassified immediately. 7 counts of homicide. And whoever had done this had been walking free for 22 years. Investigators tore through the original files, every report. Every interview, every scrap of paper from 1998 was re-examined with fresh eyes and a new understanding. That's when they found the buried lead. In a supplemental folder from the original investigation was a witness statement that had been logged and forgotten. A truck driver named Earl Hoskins had reported seeing a military vehicle driving away from Blackwood Ridge around 23 on the night of November 14, 1998. More than an hour after the patrol lost contact, the vehicle had been heading toward Fort Brecken, not away from it. Back then, investigators assumed Hoskins was mistaken. Wrong time, wrong vehicle. The statement was filed and never followed up on. Now, it looked very different. If Hoskins was right, someone had left Blackwood Ridge after the patrol went silent, someone with access to a military vehicle. Someone who knew those roads, someone who had returned to base while 7 bodies lay cooling in the dirt. The investigation turned inward. Personnel records from 1998 were pulled and cross-referenced. Duty rosters were analyzed. Disciplinary files were reviewed. One name kept appearing in places it shouldn't. Staff Sergeant Victor Harlan. Harlan had been the logistics officer responsible for patrol assignments. He was the one who'd sent the Blackwood Seven along the eastern perimeter that night. He was also the last person on record to speak with Sergeant Reeves before the patrol departed. His service record looked clean. 14 years in the Army, no major infractions, steady promotions, honorable discharge in 2001. But the details told a different story. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Harlan had submitted an emergency transfer request. He'd cited family reasons. The request was approved with unusual speed, bypassing normal review channels. Records showed no family emergency at the time. After leaving the military, Harlan moved to rural Tennessee, bought property, lived quietly, avoided anyone from his Army days like they carried a disease. And here was the detail that made investigators' blood run cold. The land where the 7 soldiers were found had belonged to Harlan's family. His grandfather had owned it decades earlier. The property changed hands several times over the years, eventually ending up with Harold Messer. But in 1998, the old access road that bordered that land was still passable. Victor Harlan would have known exactly how to get there. A warrant was issued on May 2, 2020. Federal agents arrived at Harlan's Tennessee property the following morning. They found him sitting on his porch, drinking coffee, watching the sun come up like he didn't have a care in the world. He didn't run, didn't resist, just looked at the officers approaching and nodded slowly, like he'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Took you long enough," he said. The search of his property produced damning evidence. In a locked storage unit behind the house, investigators found military gear that should have been returned or destroyed years ago. Ammunition, communications equipment, personal items that didn't belong to him. In his bedroom, hidden beneath a loose floorboard, they found a journal. Most of the entries were mundane: notes about errands, complaints about the weather, reminders about bills. But the entry dated November 15th, 1998, the day after the patrol vanished, contained 4 sentences that would seal his fate. It had to be done. They saw too much. No other way. God forgive me. Folded inside the journal's back cover was a hand-drawn map of Blackwood Ridge, and on that map, a small X marked near a creek bed, the exact location where 7 soldiers had been buried for 22 years. Victor Harlan was transported to Kentucky and charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. For most of it, Harlan denied everything, claimed the journal was fiction, claimed the map was from a hunting trip, claimed he hadn't been anywhere near Blackwood Ridge that night. Then investigators showed him the forensic photographs, the crushed skulls, the broken bones, the severed vertebra in Marcus Cole's neck. Something in him cracked, his shoulders dropped, his hands stopped moving. He stared at those photographs for a long time without blinking. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You want to know what happened? Fine, I'll tell you. But none of it's going to bring them back. Nothing ever will." The confession was worse than anyone imagined. In 1998, Victor Harlan had been running a black market operation, stealing military supplies and selling them to contacts in the region: weapons, ammunition, medical equipment, communications gear. The operation had been running for nearly 2 years without detection. The abandoned mining facility near Blackwood Ridge was his storage point, remote, forgotten, perfect for hiding contraband until buyers could move it out of state. On the night of November 14th, Harlan was at the facility meeting with 3 buyers, a routine exchange, quick and quiet. But he'd made a critical mistake. The radio call about suspicious activity near the facility wasn't random. Someone had actually seen lights near the abandoned buildings and reported it to the base. And Harlan's own patrol assignment had sent 7 soldiers directly toward the location where he was conducting illegal business. When the patrol arrived at the mining facility, they found everything: the stolen equipment, the buyers, Harlan standing in the middle of it with cash in his hand. Sergeant Reeves recognized him immediately, demanded an explanation, reached for his radio. Harlan panicked. He wasn't alone. The 3 men he was dealing with were armed and violent. Men who had no intention of going to prison. What happened next wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. The soldiers were outnumbered and caught completely off guard. Reeves was struck from behind before he could transmit. Hutchins and Schaefer tried to resist and were beaten into the dirt. Williams dropped to his knees and started praying. Jackson fought like a man possessed. It took all 3 buyers to bring him down. Vance never screamed. She just stared at Harlan with cold fury until one of the men knocked her unconscious, and Marcus Cole, the youngest, the rookie, the kid who'd been so desperate to prove himself, he ran. Harlan chased him down at the tree line, dragged him back by the collar, forced him to his knees in front of the others. "He saw my face," Harlan said in the confession, clearest of any of them. "He was going to remember. He was going to talk. So I made sure he couldn't." The knife was military issue. A combat blade Harlan had carried for years. He killed a 19-year-old boy to protect a smuggling operation. Afterward, they loaded the bodies into the patrol truck and drove to the land Harlan knew from childhood, his grandfather's old property. Land nobody had any reason to search. They buried the 7 soldiers in a shallow trench near the creek, covered them with dirt and rocks, drove the truck back toward the main road, wiped it down, left it near the tree line where searchers would eventually find it. Then Harlan returned to Fort Brecken, filed a false report about radio malfunctions, acted shocked when the search began, even volunteered to help look for the missing soldiers. For 22 years, he slept in a warm bed while 7 families lived in agony. He built a life while theirs fell apart. He grew old and comfortable while their children grew up without parents, while their parents died without answers, while the people who loved them waited and wondered and slowly lost hope. 22 years of freedom built on 7 graves. The trial was held in federal court in Louisville. The evidence was overwhelming. The journal, the map, the forensics, the confession that detailed every brutal moment of that night. Harlan's attorneys tried to argue diminished capacity, claimed he'd acted out of panic, not premeditation, claimed he was as much a victim of circumstance as the soldiers he'd killed. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Guilty. All 7 counts of first-degree murder. Guilty of conspiracy. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty of theft of military property. Victor Harlan was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He would die in a cage. It was the least he deserved. During victim impact statements, the courtroom fell absolutely silent. Sarah Reeves went first. She stood at the podium with a framed photograph of Michael and spoke about raising 2 children alone, about explaining to them why their father never came home, about watching them grow up with a hole in their hearts that nothing could ever fill. Andre Williams's niece spoke on behalf of her grandmother, who had died 5 years earlier, still waiting for answers. She described a woman who never stopped praying, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing her son would walk through the door. A woman who lit a candle every night for 20 years and went to her grave whispering Andre's name. Elena Vance's sister Maria came in full dress uniform. She stood at attention before the court and delivered a statement that lasted barely 2 minutes. She didn't cry, didn't waver, just spoke clearly about the sister who had inspired her, the soldier who had shown her what courage looked like, the woman who deserved to be remembered not as a victim, but as a hero. Then she saluted the 7 photographs displayed near the evidence table and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Harlan sat motionless through all of it, didn't speak, didn't apologize, showed no sign that any of it touched him at all. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he barely lifted his head. "Nothing I say changes what happened," he muttered. "Nothing changes anything now." He was wrong. The truth changes everything. After the trial, the remains of the Blackwood Seven were returned to their families with full military honors. 7 flag-draped caskets carried by honor guards, 7 graveside services with rifles firing in salute, 7 folded flags placed into trembling hands, 7 families finally able to say goodbye. In Millers Creek, a memorial was erected near the entrance to Fort Brecken. 7 white crosses standing in a row, 7 names carved into stone, 7 flames that burn every November 14th and will never be allowed to go out. Sheriff Raymond Caldwell attended the dedication ceremony. He was in a wheelchair by then, oxygen tank beside him, body failing but spirit holding on. When they asked him to speak, he looked at the memorial for a long moment before finding his voice. "I spent 22 years wondering what happened to these kids," he said. 22 years driving those roads, walking those woods, praying for something I couldn't find. I blamed myself for not looking hard enough, blamed the ground for swallowing them whole, blamed God for staying silent when I needed answers most. He paused, wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. But the truth is, it wasn't the ground that hid them. It was a man, a coward, someone who looked at 7 lives and decided his freedom mattered more. And now that man is going to spend every day he is left locked in a cell while these soldiers finally get to rest in peace. It's not justice, not really. Justice would mean they're still alive, but it's something. It's the truth. And sometimes the truth is all we have left to give. He died 3 months later. They buried him in the Millers Creek Cemetery, close enough to the memorial that some people say he's still keeping watch. The fields near Blackwood Ridge are quiet now. The sinkhole has been filled. The access road has been permanently closed. The old mining facility was torn down, the debris hauled away, the land given back to the forest. But people still go out there sometimes. They park at the edge of what used to be Harold Messer's back pasture and walk to the place where the bodies were found. They leave flowers. They leave flags. They leave handwritten notes addressed to soldiers who will never read them. The fog still creeps through those hollows on cold November nights. The wind still moves through the trees like it's searching for something. And if you stand out there long enough, in the silence, you can almost feel them. 7 soldiers climbed into a truck on November 14th, 1998. They drove into the darkness to do their duty. They trusted their country, trusted their uniforms, trusted the man who sent them down that road, and that man betrayed them in the worst way imaginable. For 22 years, the earth kept their secret, buried it beneath rain and time and silence. Let the world forget. Let the families suffer. Let the guilty walk free. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It rises, it surfaces, it demands to be seen. And now, finally, after all those years, those 7 soldiers rest not as missing, not as forgotten, not as unsolved names in a dusty file. They rest as remembered. They rest as honored. They rest as proof that no matter how deep you bury your sins, no matter how many years you run, no matter how hard you try to erase what you've done, the ground always gives it back. Always, because some secrets are too heavy for even the earth to hold, and some debts can never be outrun. 7 soldiers, 7 lives, 7 futures stolen by a man who thought the darkness would protect him forever. He was wrong. And now the world knows their names. Sergeant Michael Reeves, Corporal Danny Hutchins, Private First Class Andre Williams, Private Marcus Cole, Specialist Ryan Schaefer, Private Terrence Jackson, Private First Class Elena Vance. Gone but not forgotten, lost but finally found. Rest easy now. You earned it. We won't forget you. None of us will. Not ever.